So these are things, these are things that that we're still healing from. Racism, I think, is a huge issue in across the country, and something that we're dealing with that impacts our communities, that I think really impacts the response to this issue. I always say, like, how many people can name 5 Native women that have gone missing in the last 5 years? Most people cannot name 2, right? Unless you're connected to a tribal community, or maybe, work with tribal communities. Most people cannot. But if I asked you to name 5 white women who have gone missing, we could all come up with them, myself included. And I think it's great, right? Like the Gabby Petito case, I think, was a perfect example of the way that systems, that media, that everybody should respond. And also, many of us are not getting, many of our communities are not getting that same response. And so it is not to say that Gabby Petito shouldn't have gotten that her case shouldn't have gotten that response, because she most definitely should have. What happened to her was a tragedy. And also, everyone deserves that same response. And then looking at sexual objectification and sexism, if you go into any Halloween store around Halloween, you will see some highly objectified costumes about Native women, right? You'll see the Pocahontas costumes, you'll see the Native American costume with like very objectified, very little clothing actually coverage. So you can see the way that our people are objectified and our women are objectified every day. And I think the thing that's really important to point out with objectification is that when we objectify someone, when we other them, it is much easier to cause harm to them, right? Because they're not fully human. When you put someone down to, reduce them down to body parts or something less than. When we were doing our interviews for the Garden of Truth project, one of the sex buyers said to a woman, "I thought we killed all of you." And so if that's what people think about us, that's what people think when they see Native women, what does that say? So looking at systemic risk factors, right? It's not about bad lifestyle choices. I think one of the common themes that we see with Native women is, and with other women of color when they go missing, is there's always a search to figure out what they did to cause their own demise, right? We will see in, for instance, I've seen media reports where instead of showing a picture, of them with their family or something that would really invoke like concern for that person, we will see mugshots or party images, or things that would cause people to feel some kind of way, like feel like, what did she do to go missing? She must have done something, and to find ways to blame her. So we have to look at poverty and housing, right? When we were doing our Garden of Truth research, we learned that 98% of the women that we interviewed were currently or previously homeless. That is a huge risk factor for being exploited. And if you are homeless, who's looking for you? How do people know when you've gone missing if you're homeless, right? So it could be days before someone notices that that person has been missing. Looking at involvement in the child welfare system. So we don't have boarding schools, forced removal for boarding schools like we did. However, we have some of the highest rates of out-of-home placement of our youth, oftentimes to non-Native homes, and many times we have young people who are being abused in those homes, right? So Minnesota has for years had some of the highest rates of out-of-home placement of our Native youth. So that is definitely a huge risk factor. Being involved, being a victim of domestic violence. Many of the homicides of Native women or of all women are related to domestic violence. So we know that that's also a big risk factor. And then, of course, the connection with prostitution and trafficking and the extreme violence that is experienced by women who are used in prostitution. So this is when we look at the child welfare system in a comparison, and this is from 2019, so not very long ago. That's 4 years ago, and I don't think it has changed a whole lot. But if we look at our, our out-of-home placements for our Native young people, it's a huge disproportionate number. Now, remember, we represent 1% of the population. So when you look at, 20 to 31% of our out-of-home placement of our young people. And these are some of the statistics around domestic violence. So 66% of Indigenous women have experienced psychological abuse, 56 physical abuse from an intimate partner, and 6%, and this is from 2016. So our current rates are with all Native women for being murdered is between 8 and 9%, but 6% of them were victims of domestic violence as well. I forgot to put the chat open. Yes, forced removals are definitely still occurring. Non-recognized tribes, most of the times they are counting. Yes, so when it comes to recognized tribes, so oftentimes they are counting. When it comes to the child welfare system, in order for ICWA to be involved, the Indian Child Welfare Act, that has to be a child who is eligible for enrollment in a recognized tribe. There are, however, state recognized tribes, and some of the data is self-identifying, right? So some of the data is limited to whether or not they are enrolled in a federally recognized tribe or enrollable, but other data is broader than that because it's self-identified. But that's a great question. And that's a huge issue, right? Because we have, we have more tribes that are getting that federal recognition, but we still have a number of state-only recognized tribes, particularly on the East Coast. There's a larger number of unrecognized tribes or only state-recognized tribes. Thank you for that question. Right. Well, right, because if you're not a recognized tribe, you're not getting access to the same resources that federally recognized. Exactly. There's no Indian health. You're not able to get access to funding. So yeah, there's a lot of disparities because you're not able to access the same resources. Thank you. And that's very relevant in this area, like on the East Coast. And then I don't know how many state recognized tribes you have in South Carolina, but I know on the East Coast in general, there's many more either state recognized tribes or unrecognized tribes. And this is just some statistics about homelessness. Homelessness is a huge issue all across the country for many communities. It's a huge problem, and even in communities, last summer we did a number of site visits to, we're a technical assistance provider for Project Beacon, which works with urban Indian programs who are working with victims of Native victims of sex trafficking. And in doing some site visits and visiting their community and looking at the connection with homelessness, we went to a couple of their homeless encampments and talked to someone who was saying, it was in Montana, in Missoula, Montana. And he said, I'm really frustrated with the term affordable housing. He's like, because many of our people here that are in this homeless encampment have jobs. Some have 2 jobs, but so who is the housing affordable for? Because it's not affordable for a lot of these people. And so I think the cost of housing has been going up, and so many of our people are homeless because they can't afford it, and they have jobs, right? So once a Native woman goes missing or dies under suspicious circumstances, all of the processes that are supposed to be responsive to her, so investigation, prosecution, sentencing, often fail to provide adequate or appropriate responses to that crime. So we looked at the connection with prostitution and trafficking. So in 2017, there were 173 sex trafficking incidents, and 20% of those victims were American Indian. Now remember, we represent 1% of the population, 20% of the victims. So we had 401 victims in 173 sex trafficking incidents. We had 182 arrests made, 96 charges, 32 convictions. So 32 convictions in 173 sex trafficking incidents. So when we look at the response to this issue, we know that we have a lot of work to do. And that's not to say that I think systems are horrible and they're doing a horrible job. I just think we have a lot of work to do, and I think we can do better. And I think, in tribal communities where you don't have, on reservation communities where you don't have jurisdiction over non-Indian offenders, it is known. And so if you know that the tribe doesn't have jurisdiction, and maybe that tribe doesn't have a great working relationship with the feds or the state or whoever is prosecuting crimes, if they decline prosecution, the tribe has no recourse. And so perpetrators of violence know this. And that leads to the vulnerabilities for Native women in our tribal communities. Looking at prevention and healing, I think, is really important. The women that we interviewed in our sex trafficking research all told us that they wanted culturally specific resources by Native women for Native women. They wanted people who understood the experience that they had gone through, that they didn't have to explain it to, that also understood the cultural context, that they could feel safe with and comfortable with. I think many of these I've already talked about. So this is our Garden of Truth report, and it's on our website. So if you would like to read the full report, it's on there. It's about 10 years old now. Sadly, it is still very, very relevant, and still huge disproportionate numbers. But 79% of the women that we interviewed were victims of child sexual abuse by an average of 4 perpetrators. And so, many people, there's a huge connection between child sexual abuse and prostitution and trafficking, and the tactics that traffickers and pimps use to groom women into prostitution and trafficking are very similar. There's there's rewards, and there's this whole grooming process that happens prior to in many cases, not all cases, prior to them being used in prostitution and trafficking. Another thing that was very connected was that about 2/3 of the women had family members who were forcibly removed and sent to boarding schools. So when we look at that impact of colonization, right, that generational historical trauma, I think we could really see it here. And many of the women that we had talked to when we were interviewing them and asking them this question, started to make the connections about maybe why their mom or their grandma or their grandpa or whoever maybe behaved in a certain way. They were like, oh, that's why, they really started to make the connections of that violence that was experienced there and that generational trauma. 92% of the women had been raped while being used in prostitution, which I think is a huge, a lot of people they think, well, if she's a prostitute, how could she be raped? And we know that whether or not you are used in prostitution or trafficking, that you still have body autonomy. And so looking at that sexual violence, even if you're someone who people would say has chose that on their own, which that's a whole other webinar. We can talk about that another time if you want. 84% had been physically assaulted, and many of them had been physically assaulted within the past 30 days of us doing the interview. So they had experienced extreme violence, which also led to a large majority of them having a traumatic brain injury. So 72% had a traumatic brain injury, which, if you know about traumatic brain injuries, can be a lifelong issue that they're dealing with, and really puts them at risk for being exploited further. I'm trying to catch up on some of these comments. Kinship, community, and resources are, yes, absolutely. Thank you, Mary Beth, for reading. It's not an easy read, so if you are going to read it, I would say take good care of yourself, because it's difficult. The other thing is that 92% of the women that we interviewed wanted to escape prostitution. And so, I mentioned it's a whole other conversation when we talk about, who's choosing it, right? Because I hear a lot of people say, well, we have a lot of care and concern for our young people, for our youth who are used in trafficking and prostitution. But when they reach the magical age of 18, suddenly we're like, well, that's a choice, right? Like, you chose that. And what we heard time and time again was stories that were not about choice. They were about necessity. They were about survival, but they were not about choice, right? So I interviewed a woman who was gang raped when she was 16 by 4 men, and went home and told her parents, and her parents kicked her out, and they blamed her and said, well, if you wouldn't have been out running the streets, this never would have happened to you. And she had nowhere to go. And within 2 hours of being out on the streets, someone purchased her for sex. And even though she had money to get a hotel, nobody was going to rent a hotel to a 16-year-old unless it's a place that is also going to exploit her further. We heard another story of a young woman who was 19 and lived with her mom, which is not uncommon. We have multi-generational households for a number of reasons. And she said that her mom was in a domestic violence relationship and was needed to go into a domestic violence shelter for her safety. And they would not allow the 19-year-old to come in because she was an adult. And so she ended up being homeless, and her friend took her to a party, and she ended up being used in prostitution and trafficking after that. And so, I think we have to look at all of those all of those issues we need to look at when we look at our, you know, our housing and our shelters. Sorry, my brain just went blank. But our shelter programs, I think we need to look at our policies and what do we do when we have multi-generational families that are coming in, and how maybe some of our policies are really putting people at risk and putting people out on the streets. And so I think it's important as we, you know, that we look at those policies and work to try and address them. And also, you know, I know that shelters have limited resources as well, but we certainly don't want to do anything that has unintended consequences. All right. Let me check and see if there's any questions. Thank you for putting not 1 federally recognized tribe, 9 state recognized tribes. Okay, and 6 state groups. Thank you. That's helpful. I didn't realize there were so many down here in South Carolina. Just to show, yeah, much I know about that. So thank you for that information. That's really helpful. So we talked about the first bullet point, that 98% of the women that we interviewed were currently or previously homeless, which puts women at risk. And nearly all of the women that we interviewed knew another Native woman who was being trafficked that they had never seen nor heard from again. We heard story after story of, oh, there was so-and-so and their pimp like took them to Detroit or to another, you know, state, and I've never seen or heard from them again. Or so-and-so, I used to see her, you know, on the streets or whatever, and now she disappeared. So we heard many, many stories like that. And I mentioned the last one already. So like I said, many of the women are groomed, right? Like when, you know, I live in the Minneapolis area where we have the Mall of America. And when the Mall of America first opened, it was a huge hub for sex trafficking, and pimps and traffickers would go to the mall to recruit, and to recruit teenagers and young people. And I remember, you know, I have a daughter who's 30 now. And that used to be the thing, right? They'd want to go to the Mall of America, and I would never let her. My poor kids who've had to grow up with a mom who knows all the dangers. So, so that limits what they can do. But I remember one time she took the train, the light rail to the Mall of America, and went on her own. And you know, as most moms do, I found out, and I made her do a report on sex trafficking and malls, and there, you know, she had to educate herself and learn about what was happening. And there was a large number of young girls who were being recruited at the mall, and groomed, right? Like I used to tell her, like, if someone says they want to buy you something, you know, it might sound great, like, oh, I want to buy you XYZ. Nobody does stuff for free. Like, some random person is not just going to randomly buy you some things for free. Now, of course, we know that at the Mall of America, they started implementing things where young people cannot, after 4 p.m., cannot go there without an adult present, unless I think they have to be over 16 or something. But so we know that our young people are at risk for being groomed, and so are our adult women, and our two-spirit relatives are also at risk and groomed due to vulnerabilities, due to being homeless, right? I'll let you stay here if you do XYZ, right? We have a Minnesota student survey that asks, it has a number of questions, and people keep adding more questions, right? So we have questions relating to mental health, relating to sexual violence, relating to, like, if you ever attempted suicide, most recently, in the last 5 years, there was a question added on, have you ever traded sex for, food, a place to stay, alcohol, drugs? And so this question is so all students like every, I think, 2 or 3 years do the student survey, but that question is only for the high school youth. And 1.3% of all youth, high school kids in Minnesota, responded that yes, they had traded sex. 4.3 of our Native youth responded that yes, they had traded sex. So that's a huge problem, right? When we have our young people who, high school youth who are trading sex for, maybe it's food, maybe it's a place to stay. And so we know that they're being groomed. Oftentimes we have victim credibility is questioned. Like I said, when you have, the media who portrays, who shows a mugshot instead of, a picture with their family, that sends a particular, message about who that person is. We did a listening session on missing and murder a few weeks ago at our statewide coalition conference. And I talked to the mother of a young girl who was 16 and who's been missing for about 1.5 years now. And she told me that when she reported her daughter missing, the cops did not look for her for 1.5 months. For 1.5 months, her daughter's 16. So what do we need to do to get a response, right? What did she need to do to get a response from those systems? We talked about, limited media coverage, and I've talked to a lot of media about, we need to do more, like we need to address this. During that conference, we also, on the first day of the conference, we learned that the Native woman that had been missing for about 5 months, her body was found on the first day of our conference. And I heard from a reporter recently who was down in the southern part of our state that week, covering the story of a white woman who was missing, and all the news outlets were down there covering the case, and they were doing multiple stories and interviewing all her relatives. And they learned, then there was the story of this young woman whose body they found. And she told me, she's like, I'm embarrassed that I didn't even know who she was. She's like, and here I was down covering the story of another woman who has been missing, and doing everything we can. And I didn't even know this Native woman was missing. And that's the issue, right? Like, that's one of the big issues, is we don't even get the coverage. And if we do, it might be one story, one night, and then we don't hear about it again. Systems sometimes are unsure about how to properly respond. There's most oftentimes family and grassroots efforts. We see a lot more grassroots efforts to address these issues. We see a lot of grassroots searches. We assisted, gave money to an amazing woman out of South Dakota who is doing searches, or North Dakota, who does searches on her own and who trains dogs, cadaver dogs, to search. And she has been called all over the country to help with searches and is doing some really amazing work. And it is her hope that all tribal communities someday will have their own dogs to be able to do these searches. But it's sad that we don't have more of that at a systems level also. So I think it's important to think about, like, what do survivors and families need? And we often think about things in a holistic manner, and we look at our medicine wheel, right? Like, and we look at what sorts of healing do we need? Like physical, like what sorts of physical healing do we need? And to look at the physical, mental, spiritual, and emotional. I think oftentimes when we have trauma, we most often think of emotional healing, right? We think about counseling, we think about talk therapy, we think about like those things that help us to manage our emotional response or help to heal the emotional trauma that we've experienced. But I think what is also really critical and important with our Native relatives is our spiritual connection, right? And so looking at back to the need for culturally specific responses, looking at spiritual ceremonies and the spiritual connection, and how do we connect that to everything, right? And then we also need to look at how that trauma lives in our body, right? And so sometimes, it's good to like move stuff out of your body, whether that's maybe you need to go for a walk or do more physical work. Maybe you need to, I have a 19-year-old who is really in love with boxing these days. And, but there's that physicalness of like getting stuff out of your body, right? And then like also looking at our mind and how things, working at what can we do with the mental piece of it also. For me, whenever I go to sleep, my brain just like cycles. It's like, oh, why didn't I do that? I forgot to do this today. And oh my gosh, I got to do this tomorrow. And I should get up and write a list. And so I started listening to sleep meditations at night so I can calm myself down, so I can get rid of those intrusive thoughts that seem to come in when everything else is quiet around me. So when we're thinking about healing and responses, I think it's really critical to look at all of those pieces because they all live within us, right? Like we don't just have an emotional piece where all of those things are connected. Yes, physical health due to ACE study, absolutely. We've learned a lot about the connection to to autoimmune diseases when you have a high ACE score, and to many of the things that we see in tribal communities and communities of color who have, high rates of trauma. So what can systems and responders do? I think when we're looking at the issues with Native women, I think one thing we need to do is to be educated on what the issues are, right? And to how it impacts communities. I think we also need to look at what is our role. So systems need to understand what their role is and then to make those connections. This picture is from last Friday, our May 5th event. We were back at the Capitol again this year, and we put up, I think he put up 14 teepees on the Capitol lawn. And you'll see those little ones, and I have another picture of it that I'll show. And we had an orange behind this one, right? Where's my mouse? Behind this one right here, there's an orange teepee that you can just only see right there. As a connection to boarding schools, and so I think when we have to understand those connections, and then we have to do what we can to respond and to push for better responses. We need to, keep pushing media to respond and to respond appropriately, right? We need to work with law enforcement to develop responses, absolutely, to not further criminalize or traumatize, right? One of the things that we heard, speaking of criminalize, one of the things that limits a woman, a Native person from reporting is that oftentimes law enforcement will run a warrant check. But if someone is responding and reporting violence, we should not be running warrant checks, right? We should be working with and treating that person as a victim, and how can we help? thank you for bringing that up. I think that's really important. These are the little orange teepees. These were done by our Native youth, and that orange, the larger orange teepee that we had, all the youth from one of our Anishinaabe schools put their handprints all over it. Monica. Someone raised Monica Dove. Do you want to unmute yourself and ask a question, or do you want to put it in the chat? Well, if you feel free to interrupt me if you want to unmute yourself, or if you want to just put your question in the chat is fine also. If I'm supposed to do something to unmute
And Monica,
you.
I unmuted you, so you should be able to speak now if you had a question, and if not, you can mute yourself. You may have hit the hand raise, but if someone does want to ask a question, I can certainly unmute you.
Thank you. I was like, if I'm supposed to do something, I'm sorry, I don't know what I'm doing. I'm still trying to find my mouse and everything, so.
Yeah, it's hard when you switch between the different systems, and you're a Mac user.
I am a Mac user. I'm a Mac user. So looking at, how to address it when someone goes missing, and what the action steps are, looking at the community response and what our systems responses are. And how do those, what does that interplay look like? How is the community response and the systems response connected? Right now, yesterday morning, one of our relatives in Minnesota made a post about a Native woman in Duluth, Minnesota, who is missing. And so we've been sharing flyers all over, and they're organizing a community search, but they cannot get the systems to respond. And I think we need to look at, like, how are we pushing to make sure that we get the systems response? We learned that many people believe that you have to have a 24-hour waiting period before you can report someone missing. And in Minnesota, we have what's called Brandon's Law, and that is not the case. You do not have, and I don't know where that started, but even I thought there was this 24-hour waiting period, and there's not. But it's a misconception out there. And so our Missing and Murdered Indigenous Relatives Office is trying to educate people about Brandon's Law, that we do not have to have you do not have to wait 24 hours to report someone missing. And look, I think we talked about most of these things. Looking at the ceremony and cultural connection, I think, is really critical in making sure that we have safe avenues to access that ceremonial and cultural response, because there are people out there who are hurting our people. And so, making sure that we're referring people and sharing safe connections, safe resources for ceremony or spiritual practices. Having good advocacy and systems responses, I think, is really critical, and really to be working together, I think, is really important. And I think, most of us do this work because we're trying to work ourselves out of a job. I would love to do something different, and to not have sexual violence, sex trafficking, missing and murdered be an issue anymore, right? Like, I do this work so that my kids have a different future, so that it looks different for them and for my grandson. And that's why most of us do this work, because we want something better and something different. And then looking at, policy and legislation, which really can impact prevention, because we can educate people forever and they're still going to do what they're going to do. But when we have a policy or a piece of legislation that says you cannot do that, or you have to do this, it changes things. And over time, it changes hearts and minds as well. Community organizing. I think that has been one of our strengths in tribal communities, is the way that we organize. So for many years, we have done a march on February 14th, much longer than we've been doing the event on May 5th. We've only been doing that for about 3 years. But February 14th, which can be sometimes really cold in Minnesota, I think we've been doing that for like 9 years. And the first time that we held our February 14th March, the first time we were a co-sponsor, but it was 25 below in Minnesota. And I know that's unheard of here in South Carolina, but it was 25 below. We must have walked 4 miles, 3 miles. It was long. It was way too long. It was cold. We had about 150 people there. And pre-pandemic, we had like 3,000 people in attendance. This is this year, 2023. It was the first in-person march we had held since before the pandemic, we did have one in 2020, right before everything shut down. And it rained. So as you can see, one of the reasons we do this is because it's about raising the visibility, and it's about, you'll see a lot of people carrying signs. Many of them have pictures on them. We want to make sure that we keep our relatives' faces out there, keep their stories alive, make sure people see us. Also, going back to that sex buyer who said, "I thought we killed all of you." It's also time, we get to take up space in the streets and let people know we are still here. And, even when it's raining or when it's 25 below, our people show up. I want to talk about youth activism, because I think what keeps me going in this work is knowing that we have some really incredible young people coming up behind us that are going to lead and are already leading. So these young people on the left, this is when they were in middle school, and they had organized, this one in the red is my daughter. They had organized a walkout, and it was that year that I feel like there were walkouts in schools multiple times for like gun violence and this and that. Like, there's a number of walkouts that year, and they organized a walkout to be able to attend our missing and murdered Indigenous relatives event on February 14th. And for most other walkouts, the practice of the school was that they cannot come back to school, but there was no other like discipline, right? Like they weren't given detention or suspended or anything else. But for when they organized the walkout to our event, they were suspended. They were faced with suspension. And I'm not sure why, but what they did to address it was that they had about 800 students and staff and faculty in their school, and they made 800 cedar ties. Cedar is a woman's medicine that we use a lot for healing. And they made 800 cedar ties with red ribbons, and then these little white slips was information about why it's important to address missing and murdered. And they put a table up at the front doors and gave one to every single staff, student, faculty person that came into school that day. And the next year, that school district brought 500 youth to our march. And in fact, they led our march. And so like, it still gives me the chills to think about the impact these girls had. And that they used the resources that they had to be able to educate the adults, really. and then for the next year to have them out leading. This is my daughter this year, last Friday, and she has been involved in that, the project through the University of Minnesota School of Social Work that's looking at the data on the Minnesota Student Survey that I shared on youth who are trading sex. And she spoke at the Capitol, you know, the same time as our, oh, Rachel, yay, the same time as our Lieutenant Governor spoke. And so to see our young people who are coming up behind us, and to see them using their voices is really inspiring to me. It's really, and it makes me feel like, okay, like as I get closer, you know, as I get older, I can, I feel comforted in knowing that we have a powerful group of young people coming up behind us that are going to lead this work. So when we look at addressing this and policy and legislation, I did a search last night just to see like how many states have task forces and who are addressing task forces. Also, Rachel is on here, and you will see all these pictures that I'm using, or a lot of them are Rachel's, who was our photographer at our event last Friday. So grateful to her for these images. So there are about 10 states that I've seen that have task forces or who have issued reports on their findings around missing and murdered. And we see more tribal efforts on that as well. We also have, you know, having representation really matters. So like in Minnesota, we have a Native woman who is our lieutenant governor, and who's, it matters to have representation at that high level to make sure that we always have a seat at the table. She makes sure that our voices are heard. And, you know, now we have Deb Holland, who, you know, is working on the Not Invisible Act Commission, who started the Not Invisible Act Commission, and they are actually right now doing listening sessions across the country. I think a couple weeks, last week or the week before, they did listening sessions up in Alaska. So they are traveling around the country. They will be coming to Minneapolis as well to do listening sessions to really understand this issue, to listen to the community, to listen to families who've been impacted, to listen to our relatives who have people who are still missing or who have been murdered. I think it's really incredible to have them out there doing that. But there's still more, you know, more coordination that's needed. Urban Indigenous Collective, that's great. Oh, that's amazing. Okay, I will have to, Danny, we will have to connect so I can get a copy of that final report. I would love to see it. You know, we have 10 states. That means there's a lot more states that are not doing it than there are states that are actually doing this work. And there are tribal people in every state, in every community. We are all over, right? So we need more work. We need more tribal and non-tribal, right? We need more efforts. We need to really heighten the voices of survivors and families. Like, we really need to raise that visibility so that all of our work should be informed by survivors and families. I'm working with the with Wilder Foundation, who wrote our Missing and Murdered Indigenous Women's Task Force report, and is now working on a project with our Missing and Murdered Indigenous Relatives Office to do some additional listening sessions with different systems providers, but I'm working with them specifically to do some listening sessions with families and survivors, because the work of the Missing and Murdered Indigenous Relatives Office should be rooted in the voices of families and survivors. All of our work should always be rooted and grounded in the voices of survivors and families and those who've been impacted. This this image always gives me chills when I look at this. So this is back to when I talked about in 2021, when we put up 3,000 red dresses. What we didn't realize until we started to put that together was that the outline on the Capitol lawn kind of looked like a jingle dress. And so we had, this is what it looks like from the Lieutenant Governor's office. To look down, it was in the shape kind of a jingle dress, and it had the 7 rows of jingles to represent the 7 generations. And so it was a really powerful image, and certainly something that when the legislators looked out on the Capitol lawn, they could not miss it. Like I said, it's really critical to center those who have been and are still missing. This is Nevaeh Kingbird, missing from the Bemidji area. That was her mom I talked about, who said that the cops did not look for her for a month and a half. She is still missing. This is Jeremy Jourdain, missing from the Red Lake Nation, who's been missing for, I think, 2.5 years, maybe 3.5 years. This is Jojo Boswell, who's been missing since 2005, so for a number of years, and still don't know what happened to her. And the last people that saw her was law enforcement, who dropped her off in some rural community and just said, there you go. This is Sheila St. Clair, who's been missing from Duluth since 2015. And it's important, I think, to always remember the names and the faces of our relatives. All right. So I was going to try, okay, yay, let's see if this works. So this is a short video. This is from the Office for Victims of Crime. And this woman is a MMIP coordinator for in Alaska. Okay, you cannot hear.
Yeah. Stop.
I stopped.
Stop sharing and then click before you share. You'll just have to jump out of your slides real quick and hit the share audio.
Oh, okay. Stop sharing.
Yeah, and then start the share again.
Okay.
And then at the bottom of the screen, there should be a button to click for audio, and then it should play.
Oh,
I forget that sometimes, but definitely you have to share that audio.
okay.
I get it. All right.
Is that up again?
Yep, it's back up again, and you should be able to start it again.
Is that, can you hear it? All right.
Yes.
I see the faces of the women who haven't come home yet.
Sorry.
Looking at, the impact of violence in our communities and the high rates of sexual violence, domestic violence, the high rates of trafficking, and the intersections with poverty and racism, and homelessness and all of the things that make this issue, more challenging to address.
This is not just an Alaska Native and American Indian issue. This is a people issue.
There isn't just one story.
We had a young man in my community who was just amazing. And then at some point just disappeared. And they found him a year later in the flats. And we don't know what happened. We certainly don't know the circumstances, but there was serious suspicion of trauma and other things that may have happened. But every story's like that.
The reality is it can happen to any of us. These are important members of our community. These are our relatives, our mothers, our grandmas, our sisters, our aunties. This is not about something that the victim did. This is not about poor lifestyle choices. This is about a decision that the perpetrator made to cause harm to another individual.
How do we heal?
Healing comes when we have culturally specific tribal strategies to address healing.
Bringing families into a place where they're back to healing and communities into a place where they're back to healing.
The Office for Victims of Crime is a federal agency that's dedicated to ensuring healing and justice for victims of all crimes.
Our perpetrators are coming from many different populations. We needed to have a venue where we could listen to tribes and we could hear what were the missing and murdered Indigenous person stories in their communities.
We have an obligation to work as hard as we can to make sure that the voices of tribal communities are heard and that we continue to listen.
The tribes came with incredible, heart-wrenching stories, but they also came with solutions and needs.
We need more coordination with law enforcement. On reservations, our jurisdiction is very complicated.
There are 229 tribes in the state of Alaska, and they cover an area of over 600,000 acres, which literally equates to about 20% of the continental U.S. Most of them are only reachable by plane or by boat. We have 80 communities that are just listed as having no law enforcement whatsoever. We're waiting hours, sometimes days, for somebody to show up.
There's so much more to do. When a loved one is murdered or missing, it doesn't just impact the loved ones of that victim. It impacts entire communities. This trauma just doesn't go away.
When something happens, we're gonna respond, and we're going to report it. And we're gonna stand up and say it's not okay.
And now in Minnesota, a huge win is that we have the first ever Missing and Murdered Indigenous Relatives office in our state government. It's permanent funding. It will not go away.
People are talking to each other. People are discussing these issues. They are solving problems with each other.
We have heard from Indigenous women that they want services by Native women and for Native women. They need to know that they can come to us and that we are a safe space for them.
We've expanded our guidance so that we can provide the assistance that the families and loved ones of missing and murdered Indigenous people need, whether or not it's been determined that a crime has occurred.
It gives me hope to see our state, tribal, federal people that are responding to this issue.
What gives me hope is that I know that change is possible.
This job has been all about hope. The relationships that we've developed, the ability to have these conversations has been so important.
Working together and working hand in hand with our tribal partners, we will be able to put in place the change that needs to happen.
We have an incredible group of people coming up behind us who are going to keep pushing this.
And it really comes down to resilience. Our tribal people were incredibly resilient.
That always gives me hope.
Oops. Alrighty. I want to say also that I think it's important that, you know, as Indigenous communities and communities of color, that we also show up for each other and build solidarity with each other. Like this year at our Missing and Murdered Indigenous Relatives event on May 5th, last Friday, we also connected with our Missing and Murdered African American Women's Task Force. We had a group from Chicago that we have partnered with many years on this issue, who brought their Black Girlhood altar to put up in the middle of our of all the teepees that were on the Capitol lawn, to really show that when we show up together, when we show up for each other and in solidarity with each other, that that we're stronger. And there's a lot of things that try to pit us against each other in a lot of ways, and I think the more we ignore those and just show up for each other, the better we'll be. So I want to open it up for questions. We have about a little under 15 minutes.
Nicole, I was going to make a few comments just to for folks in the state of South Carolina to think about. We just recently had a new human trafficking task force that was developed out of the Attorney General's office. So this is an issue that, you know, we want that task force to definitely examine and take on. My understanding right now is our Native American South Carolinians are in an other category, and that's something that definitely needs to be changed. So as folks, you know, when you're writing your senators or getting in touch with the Attorney General's office, you know, mention that, talk about that. And, you know, as I put in the data for our local tribes, and we'll send that out, definitely partner with your local tribes. Look at the MMIW Day on May 5th as an opportunity to support the tribes in your area. And also the South Carolina Indian Affairs Commission has partnered with the College of Social Work here in Columbia, and they have been examining missing and murdered Indigenous peoples in South Carolina. And we see a pattern along the I-95 corridor, and also, of course, around Rock Hill. And many of our tribes don't have federal recognition, because that is a whole nother topic that goes into the difficulty of receiving recognition. And that is a way that we can be supportive of as well. So, you know, there are lots of things that we as member organizations, and I know we've got some law enforcement victim advocates on the phone and some of our solicitors' offices, to bring to light some of the issues that our local tribes are facing. And we can certainly make connections with the South Carolina Indian Affairs Commission. I put their Facebook site and also the state website on there. They are part of the Minority Affairs Commission. So I just encourage y'all to think about these connections and things that we can do. And I'm sure there are some things we're doing, but just to call attention and raise that flag. So just a few comments just to maybe even get some ideas spurred.
Yeah, that's awesome. And Danny, I would love to collaborate or partner with you. So I will have my contact information up, and yeah, I'd love to talk more. So this is my contact information.
Any questions, thoughts?
Oh, Angela Town. I'm reticent to take the focus off of survivors, and at the same time, I keep thinking, oops, what in the world is wrong with some men? Why is so broken in them? Do you know of any movement towards addressing people who? Yes, well, I know that there's been a lot of work in the last 10 years or so on engaging men and boys. And I don't know that it's specific to addressing men who perpetrate against Indigenous people, but just, you know, I think we need a lot more work in addressing, you know, toxic masculinity and how we're raising our men and boys and having conversations with them, because honestly, like, you know, we're all in this community together. And so there's like, how are we raising them to think certain ways? Like, one of our partners on our research was Melissa Farley, who works with the Prostitution Research and Education Group out of San Francisco. And they have done a lot of work on men who purchase sex. And the men know that the women are, that they're victims of violence, that they're victims of sexual violence, that they're being abused, but it's almost like a rite of passage. And there are very little consequences. And so, I think we can learn a lot from studies like that really try to understand from that level about what that is. And I think, it has to do with healing. Like, I think our men need healing too. I think we have to look at responses to violence and accountability. And I think we need to look at accountability outside of the criminal justice system. And what is community accountability? So I think there's a lot of conversations to have about how to address that.
Yeah, and that's definitely where some of our restorative justice work comes into play, and the work that Aparna is doing at the USC School of Law, and some of y'all have sat in on a few of her webinars. So I encourage you to keep thinking about where can we have some of that community healing and work that can be done.
Yeah. And I don't have, someone asked a question about what percentage of the missing and murdered are women versus men, children versus adults. I don't have all of that. Like, when we did our missing and murdered Indigenous women's task force, we did focus specifically on women. And so all of the data that we gathered through that was specific to women, but we know certainly that it is not only women, and that it also includes our men, which is why when we got the legislation to start the office, it's the Missing and Murdered Indigenous Relatives Office, to be able to work with men, women, or young people. So I don't know, sadly, I don't know all the statistics on that. Great question, though. Now I'm gonna have to go back and look and find out. Are there other questions? Well, I just want to say thank you, everyone. It's great to be with you all today.
Yes, and we want to thank Nicole definitely, and thank her for being here tomorrow with our South Carolina Native American folks for actually honoring with a MMIW summit, which will be part of that spiritual piece of this work too. So we want to thank her for being here and visiting South Carolina for more than just this webinar, but for that event as well.
Yes, thank you. Thank you, everyone, and have a wonderful weekend.
Yes. Mother's Day, yes. To everyone, all the mothers out there.
Yes, happy Mother's Day.
Have to celebrate those moments, that's for sure. Family is so important. Everyone have a wonderful weekend. I'm going to go ahead and end the webinar. And again, thank you for joining us. Check out our website. We have another webinar next month that is going to focus on working with attorneys and our victim advocates to really help maximize and provide as many options as possible for survivors. So Scott McNeish with Legal Counsel, who's the lead for the VOCA Legal Counsel, will be joining us. And we've got a couple of folks from our Angela Perez. Yes, she will be joining us as a panelist. And Kim will be joining us too. So we've got a panel, and that will be a great hands-on. What can you do for legal advocacy within your agencies? So please check out our website and upcoming. We have another webinar in July on criminalized survivors that promises to be an excellent webinar. So again, thank you for joining us.